5 minutes to Mr. Bob Good from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you to our witnesses here. I agree with what my colleague was saying a few moments ago about the responsibility that we have as a House. We have primary responsibility for the power of the purse, if you will, and we have responsibility to protect the ability of the federal government to borrow when necessary and to pay our debts, obviously, which is always absolutely necessary. And I would submit that a default will take place. A default will take place when we can no longer borrow, when we can no longer sell our debt, or when we can no longer make our payments. And so I would go to Mr. Walker, help us with that. When would we begin to reach that, do you foresee, when we would have difficulty borrowing, selling our debt, and or making our payments on the debt?
First, only God knows, and God's not telling us. But let me touch on your issue. There's a lot of disinformation and misinformation going around about the debt ceiling, okay? First, it's failed. It needs to be replaced with a debt-to-GDP approach, okay, which can succeed and has in other countries. Secondly, there's only one thing guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States financially. One thing, and that's debt and accrued interest on the debt. Nothing else is guaranteed. Social Security, Medicare, those are important. They're not guaranteed.
If I may interject, that's the only thing that's really mandatory, right?
Right. Secondly, as long as the Social Security and Medicare trust funds have bonds in them, then you can pay benefits on a timely fashion. And they do have bonds in them. Why? Because they are closely held debt, they are counted in the debt ceiling. So if you need cash, you end up just converting from intragovernmental bonds to bonds held by the public. It doesn't change the debt ceiling a dime, all right? So A, we're not going to default on our debt. We can't because of the Constitution. Secondly, we can pay Social Security and Medicare benefits, but you can't pay other things in a timely manner, all right? And if the Treasury says that they haven't been able to prioritize, then they better read the Constitution, okay? That's their job, okay? So you will have to make tough choices. Things won't get paid on time. But the bottom line is we're not going to violate the debt ceiling. The question is, what are the conditions to raising it? And there should be conditions. We are out of control.
Yeah, the American people should be greatly concerned at the incompetency or perhaps the unwillingness to recognize the situation that you just described. To your point, we had the budget director, which is a funny term to apply to this administration. We had the budget director here just recently for our last hearing. And to what you were speaking about earlier, Mr. Walker, I asked her, do you know what our percent to GDP, debt to GDP is? And she did not know. She said it was 90-something%. When I asked her, after I told her it was about 125%, and I said, when is the last time we were at that level of debt to GDP? She did not know, so I had to tell her that it was some 80 years ago at the end of World War II. And obviously, how would we absorb a crisis like that? How would we react to a crisis like that? How would we fund a real threat to the country when you come in with 125% of GDP? That also said, to the point you just made a moment ago, I led a letter to Janet Yellen, Secretary of Treasury, asked her, what is her plan to ensure we don't have a default, to prioritize payments, to prioritize spending? And she could not or would not answer that with the letter that she sent back to me. So Americans should have great concern about the incompetency or the lack of ability to recognize the problems that we do have. I want to move to Mr. Hodge for a moment. The president's budget assumes an inflation rate of 2.4%. You know, we're currently in the range of 6%. When you come out with a unprecedented $7 trillion budget, spending about $20,000 per American citizen just in a year's time, and projecting a $2 trillion deficit the first time, is there any reason to believe that might bring down inflation?
Oh, goodness, no.
Yeah. Can you speak to how we got to the inflation that we have and what the president's proposed budget might do to inflation?
Congressman, over the next 10 years, the president's budget is proposing to spend $82 trillion. I just let that sit out there. Let us absorb $82 trillion. Unfortunately, or fortunately, they're proposing to tax $65 trillion. Both are over the baseline. These are breathtaking. I was here 30 years ago when John Kasich was chairman, saying exactly the same thing, but the deficit was only $200 billion, a pedestrian $200 billion. All of the things that I outlined in my testimony about cutting spending and solving the entitlement problems were true then in 1995 as they are today. The failure to deal with those problems in the interim has brought us to this point.
Thank you, Mr. Hodge. I've exceeded my time, but that $82 trillion is about $1 million per citizen, or excuse me, per taxpayer, about $1 million per taxpayer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.